Well, welcome, friends from the United States of America and around the world to Ukraine Story Podcast. This is a special edition, a very special edition, because this week we are honoring the second year anniversary of one of the greatest criminal acts of our generation, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it was 2 years ago, on February 24th, 2022, that Vladimir Putin invaded the sovereign nation of Ukraine. And since that time, we've seen a crisis of refugees. We've seen millions of people displaced. And in the midst of that, there have been a few voices of clear reporting and sanity. And I happen to have one of them here with us on our podcast today. I am so pleased to welcome Joe Lindsley. Joe, thank you so much for being here with us today.
DW, honor. Good to talk to you guys. Thanks for that introduction. I am here in Kharkiv right now, 30 miles from Russia. And, I was thinking, I've been here every moment of the full-scale invasion. I get 10 minutes a day on Chicago's WGN radio every single weekday for two years now. But that first day of the full-scale invasion, I was in Lviv, and it was terrifying to be in Lviv that day. That was as close as you could, as far away from Russia within Ukraine as you could be, and it was terrifying. And I don't think I ever could have imagined that 2 years later, with this still going, I'm now, almost as close as you could be to Russia, and sort of, with less fear than I had that day 2 days ago. And DW, as you mentioned, this big anniversary of the full-scale invasion, this week is also the 10-year anniversary of one of the most extraordinary revolutions in human history, the Maidan. That for anyone who believes in faith, family, and freedom, the events of Maidan 10 years ago, that's why this war is happening. And I keep trying to remind people that was 10 years ago this week that the Ukrainian people stood successfully in the streets until the corrupt regime fled. And that's
okay. Joe, you are so completely right. Honor and I were standing and filming Maidan in November of 2023, and we were there with people who were at Maidan 10 years beforehand. Yeah. And I interviewed people around Ukraine from the West to Kyiv who actually were present at Maidan. And I have to say that it's one of the most inspiring moments, but not if you listen to Tucker Carlson or Vladimir Putin, who seem to believe that Maidan was some sort of an American coup, rather than a million people coming out there and saying, actually, we want to be free, we want to have elections. Can you explain to us the difference between myth and reality on this 10th anniversary of Maidan?
Yeah, well, I've been in Ukraine since the pandemic, sort of accidentally. I was traveling the world. I had previously worked at Fox News, and I escaped in the car chase, and then Hollywood made some TV show, and I wanted to get away from all that. I was traveling the world, and I came to give a lecture in Lviv on media, and the pandemic started, and I realized this was going to be one of the freest countries in the world. So I stayed throughout the pandemic, and then I felt I had an obligation to stay when Russia launched the big invasion. But because of that, I know I have so many friends, including some who are now dead in battle, who were there in Maidan. And, if you're here for even just a few days, you'll meet people who were there during those days, during that winter of 2013 to 2014. And it was an extraordinary thing. It was, Maidan is so much of what many people in the West, especially Americans, are pining for, an opportunity to feel that they have agency and ability, that they're not sort of puppets of corrupt elites. And, we see, people like Tucker and others, they'll so easily praise protest, recently, say in Ireland or Poland or, movements around or Ottawa, but they miss the most effective sort of freedom protest of our times. And maybe part of it's they just can't believe that something like that could actually work. But Maidan was so extraordinary. The people stood in the main square. It started because sort of students in opposition to the pro-Putin president sort of trying to tear Ukraine away or bring Ukraine totally into the orbit of Moscow in the same way that Belarus is now. It was a smaller protest. But when the secret police began to fire upon the students, it reawakened the nation. The day of that reawakening, it was the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, which is interesting because they took the wounded from the main square to the monastery, the Golden Dome Monastery of St. Michael, and they rang the bells. And when those bells in Kyiv have run for 1,000 years, whenever there was a threat, whether it was the Mongols invading or in this case the pro-Putin forces attacking the people, and that awakened this nation. And people lived in that square until the pro-Putin regime fled 10 years ago from yesterday, from the 22nd of February. And as one friend who was there describes it, that Maidan was the first successful Ukrainian state. It's extraordinary what they achieved. And as the revolution began to work, the last days of February, even the police were gone. The regime fled, and all the authorities were gone. And there was no looting. No one was burning shops. There was this amazing sense of cooperation, and they really showed the wonderful possibility of democracy. And I think we need more people to understand this. Unfortunately, I think the press doesn't talk about it because it's not something they really care about. It's sort of this wild freedom. Foreign leaders like President Macron and others, they're never going to talk about Maidan because they don't want a revolution like that in their countries. And so that's part of the reason why we have this informational barrier. But if more Americans knew about it, I think they'd be here doing everything they could to help.
You know, a couple of years ago, Putin sat down with pro-communist director Oliver Stone and put together a series, actually ended up being basically 2 documentaries, and then it was expanded to more than that. And in it, he alleged that Maidan was merely a CIA plot to overthrow the government. Now, I think if you know anything about the facts, that argument utterly falls apart. But to people that are very conspiratorial minded, that are already suspect, and who want to dismiss everything on partisan grounds, it was a great setup preliminary to the full-scale invasion when he did that. Unfortunately, those sort of false thinkings have been reiterated to millions with the Putin-Carlson interview that took place about a week ago. How do we help people to wade through this issue of Soviet disinformation, not only about Maidan, but about just about everything related to Ukraine? That's part of your job, I realize.
Yeah, you know, and I've gone through this introspection and asked myself this very disturbing question. But if I had never been to Ukraine, I first came here in 2018, traveling around the world. If I had never been here, and I came from the world of Fox News and other places like that, and I started my career working for Bill Kristol at the Weekly Standard, but Bill's a great guy, but I rejected the war machine, the Iraq, Afghanistan war machine, as did so many friends of mine who served there.
I'm with you completely on that. I'm totally with you on that.
We realized that, it was for the benefit of the elite few, and we were all sort of lied into it. And so I think if I had never been in Ukraine, this is tough for me to say, but like I could see myself being one of the Ukraine skeptics in America, just lacking the information. And I went back the other day and re-listened to that because the sort of the cornerstone of one of the cornerstones of the arguments against Ukraine is that the one woman in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, helped orchestrate the whole revolution. And if you listen to that, there was a leaked call from like mid-February 2014, where she's speaking with another American official, and it sounds like they're just playing chess and deciding if the government falls, who are they going to replace? And if you listen to it, I could see, saying, oh, this sounds like we're trying to, that we are directing it. But if you look more closely, actually, it's what bureaucrats love to do anyway. I mean, the revolution was happening, and the Americans, as were Europeans and many others, were trying to manage it. In fact, it was the EU and the US. They were trying to keep Yanukovych in power. They didn't want too extraordinary of a revolution, and they were trying to make a deal and trying to mitigate the radical freedom of the revolution because there's something foreign to them. And so, and this is really, and I think it's also the arrogance of our, of our government and our diplomats. I mean, I have a big problem with this. Victoria Nuland, was recently here in Ukraine, and she had a big photo op arriving in Kyiv, the White House, the Biden administration has to know that that just feeds the propaganda. But in their arrogance, they don't want to correct it. She would never come out and say, I really didn't orchestrate it, because I think secretly, I know it. I worked in Washington, as you live there. Like, secretly, probably people like Victoria Nuland, think, oh, this is pretty cool. People think I created this, and so it really annoys me that they won't clear that up. But there's, if you think about what that revolution did, it wasn't just getting rid of the pro-Putin regime, but it was a reawakening of the Ukrainian identity. I know this as an Irish American too. Like, the Irish, our history, our language, everything was oppressed for centuries. Ukrainians, from 2014, they were able to go deep into their roots. There was a reawakening of their culture, of their language, of their whole identity. So much of which is grounded in this idea of freedom, which goes back to the Cossacks and the wild fields. The Ukrainians had, and I never knew this till I came here, even though I studied political theory and constitutional theory, Ukrainians had a constitution with separation of powers in 1711. The constitution of Philip Orlik down in the Cossack heartland in Zaporizhia. And, this is, so the Ukrainians have been, on this freedom quest for a long time. And Maidan was the moment where they really recovered that spirit. But even if you just look at the question of language, like, okay, in Ireland today, everyone speaks English. Even the Irish have not recovered their language. In Ukraine, even here, I'm in Kharkiv, which was a Russian-speaking city because of the Soviet control. People speak Ukrainian. They have recovered that. That was all a turning point. That happened because of the revolution. So if you tell me that one person or even a team at the State Department, created this incredible freedom culture, sort of reinvigorated the language. I mean, we can barely handle things in the U.S.
Joe, you're so right. One of my side hustles is I'm an attorney, and I can tell you, if the Victoria Nuland tape were put on as evidence in a trial, we would destroy it within 60 seconds. The reason being, so what if she said that? People have these conversations all the time. It's this tremendous lust, this urge to find the little smoking gun that somehow proves an effort that affects millions and millions of people. Well, Victoria Nuland did not bring out 1 million people to Maidan. That didn't happen at all. And it really doesn't matter what she said. It doesn't equal action or what took place there. But it certainly feeds the propaganda mill for people who want to say whatever it is they want to say. And it's the same kind of thinking that says, look, we didn't see the proper shadow in a film, therefore NASA never landed on the moon. These sorts of things reach people. They end up believing it, but it actually has no connection to reality itself. Well, Joe, you still with me over there?
I'm still here. Yes, my video cuts in and out.
Okay, great. Okay, Joe, one thing I want to say is I want to make a comment about your show. Your show is great. And here's why I love your show. It's humble. You actually present very hard things in a very humble manner. It's crystal clear. It's timely. I mean, every single day you're talking about the issues that are relevant that week, that day. I just want to encourage viewers to go listen to Joe, because his show is fantastic and you can digest it every day. I wonder if people in your Chicago audience, may get tired about hearing of Ukraine each day, but I think it doesn't matter. We have to keep getting that message out there. Would you say, in terms of, look, there are a lot of issues. I care about a lot of issues. My sense of things is this is the issue, or a issue, that will define the next 20, 30, 40 years. How important is the question of Ukraine? Is it a big issue, or is it just another issue?
Yeah, I think it is, as you say, it's a definitive issue. But even before that, I mean, I realize this by living here every day, and every American that I've brought to Ukraine from Lviv, and usually I bring them all the way here to Kharkiv. What these are Americans, whether they're like a liberal professor from Harvard, or conservative veterans from America, or evangelicals from Colorado, everyone imaginable. They all are so inspired by the story that they see here. And I think I describe Ukraine as the best self-help book. I mean, this is every day here is a manual of how to do extraordinary things in the most difficult of circumstances. And this is what is a huge gap. Like, this is the stuff that Joe Rogan talks about, but totally there's sort of a black hole about Ukraine. It's one thing we're trying to change and punch through. Like, I mean, for example, I just a couple of hours ago, I was running through Kharkiv, and there was a coffee shop that the Russians bombed around New Year's. They destroyed it with a suicide drone built in Iran, by the way, because they're allies. And a month later, that place is almost ready to reopen. It's extraordinary, and it can also get hit at any moment. I mean, this city is incredibly vulnerable. The West does not protect places like Kharkiv, and it doesn't matter. They have this incredible spirit of resilience, and I realized I've been doing the WGN broadcast, every day, every weekday, and you can see them at UkrainianFreedomNews.com, YouTube, and Spotify. But after the first month of those broadcasts, I realized that if I simply repeated just said the headlines in those 10 minutes a day, people are going to tune out. And I realized, like for a while that, I would just be Bakhmut, Bakhmut, Bakhmut. And this is kind of what the Russians do, just kind of wear people out. And I realized I was surrounded by these incredible stories. So I began to travel the country, and as we were delivering supplies and getting to know people, and I just picturing myself, like if I'm driving to work in the Dan Ryan Expressway or, on the L in Chicago, what kind of, how do you keep people engaged? And people, need to hear stories of the tragedy, but also of inspiration and humor and the full spectrum of life that you see here. And every single foreigner I know, especially Americans who come here, they're sad when they leave. Maybe you guys had this experience, but I mean, like you're in a war zone and they want to be back.
It's so completely true. By the way, you talk about the rebuilding. Your city where you are right now has been hit pretty hard. We were doing interviews with survivors in Bucha and in Irpin. And when I walked onto the principal street, I had all the photographs of utter destruction, dead bodies everywhere. That entire street is rebuilt. Bucha has been rebuilt in a year. This is Ukrainian resolve. They're indefatigable. They are just ferocious in their commitments to freedom. It's something that Americans used to believe was part of our national identity. I think we're so polarized. We're missing something. We can learn a lot from these people.
Yeah, and this is it's sad when I see, whether it's the Babylon Bee or audience of, Russell Brand or Tucker Carlson missing this story. And we're just, and then there's plenty of people who profit, and I know this from my time at Fox, but this applies to all media, people that profit from keeping us divided, and from keeping us uninspired and angry. There was that song, it became #1 on Billboard last year. It even beat Taylor Swift, I think. Richmond north of Richmond, right?
Yeah.
And it was hugely popular. And I went back and I listened to it, and okay, the complaints are, the guy is right to make these complaints. There's a lot of problems in American life, but the song is hopeless. He says, I've sold my soul. And then I realized, because I was talking with a friend there who's a musician who often sings in English. I'll share the music with you. Sasha Bull, the Ukrainian, he's got a song, I'm Too Old to Sell My Soul. And I realized that, in America, Ukrainians have the same complaints about corruption and the elites trying to run everything. I mean, that's what the revolution was about. We can talk about that, in Burisma and all that stuff. But the Ukrainians have the same grievances, but they don't just wallow in it. They actually work together and change things. And that's what was so extraordinary about Maidan. That was what's extraordinary about, the first months of the full-scale invasion. I mean, the government was kind of a mess here. They were not really prepared. And it was the people that defended the country. I mean, here in Kharkiv, in North Saltivka, in those Soviet-era apartment buildings, it was the citizens shooting out of the windows at the invading Russians and keeping them out of the city. So this is an incredible story of humans, of citizens, not only living freely, but actually protecting their democracy. And I think in some ways, it's so extraordinary and so hard to imagine that Americans write it off. I mean, when I see Americans and Elon Musk and others praising Conor McGregor and some protest in Ireland, and they even use the word "we're fighting with you, Ireland," because of some problems they have. And then the actual fight is happening here. It's like Viktor Orban puts in his bio on X, freedom fighter. No, the neighboring country is actually fighting. And so, but I think part of it is that it's just so hard to imagine that people could actually believe so much in freedom that they're really, really willing to die for it. And I was at a concert in Lviv around Christmas time, which, and by the way, Ukrainians, like, they're a very tolerant country. I mean, there's Jewish president, Crimean Tatar Muslim Secretary of Defense. It is a majority Christian country where, like, in Lviv, in the Greek Catholic city Lviv, on Sundays, the churches are packed. People are standing outside in the squares. It's like Catholic Istanbul because they broadcast the mass into the streets. It is extraordinarily traditional and yet tolerant. And around Christmas time, which they celebrate for a whole month, they call it Ukrainian Ramadan. It's the opposite because it's not fasting. And even in wartime, especially in war, they're singing their traditional songs. And I was at a concert, and you have like pink and purple haired people singing the ancient traditional songs. And like that, this is and there was some volunteers from the U.S. and Central America here, and they said, "I've never seen anything like this. Like, how can I possibly explain this to the world? Like, this is like, people who would not fit this idea of traditional. Everyone here is sort of connected in these traditions, and there's this unusual embrace of tradition and tolerance and I think that's the only way a society like this could survive the onslaught. And even like last winter, I was here in Kharkiv very often, and it was there was hardly, very often we had no power, no electricity, which, by the way, this is another sign of victory. Like this winter, the Russians have not had any successful attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, a story that gets totally missed. But last winter, it was like living in the Middle Ages. And I could walk down the streets of this city, and not for 1 second in the total darkness did I think I was something like someone would rob me or something. The only threat is from the missiles in the sky. The crime is low. This country is such an example of how you can build great societies. And Russia is, and their witting and unwitting allies are doing everything they can to erase from history and from reality the story of a nation that is actually our best example of freedom and tradition and tolerance in the world.
In the whole world. I hear you. I feel you. I saw it. Joe, when we were in Ukraine, we visited and put on camera, in many cases, Armenian Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Eastern Rite Catholic, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Jews, Baptists, Assemblies of God, Protestant. My guide for part of my trip was a doctor who does work on the front line in the East with people. He's a Mohammedan. He's Islamic. Every person I asked, I said, what is religious freedom like? And this is the freest nation in the world for religious freedom. Everyone felt that they could thrive. Another thing is that the vast majority of people, whoever they are, they say, oh, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian. And they identify with Orthodox Christianity. The majority of people do. But the evangelicals, they're hardcore. The Jews, they're committed. Of course, that's part of my background. Is my great-grandfather was a Jew from Lviv, Ukraine, once upon a time, driven out by Russians, incidentally. But here's the problem, Joe, and it's a big whopper problem. In America, Christians think that Ukraine is the centerpiece of the persecution of Christians. Now, when I ask Ukrainians, it doesn't matter who they are, Jews, Orthodox, Protestants, they all say, oh, the Muscovite Patriarchy, that's not a church, that's a military branch of Vladimir Putin and Cossacks. Yeah. Can you please give us a little perspective? Because Americans think Zelensky's persecuting Christians. Man, I sure feel like the opposite was true.
It is. It's the opposite. I mean, there is persecution here, and it's when Russians are bombing churches. In fact, in Odessa, it was last summer, the Russians bombed the Russian Orthodox of the Moscow Patriarchy Church. So even bombing their own parts of the Moscow Patriarchy. But this has been, the Russian Orthodox Church, with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, all that was outlawed. They stopped Christmas and everything. But then Stalin brought the church back. As constituted today, it's an arm of Russia, of the Russian government. Plenty of evidence that Patriarch Kirill was in the KGB, as was Putin, and they have functioned as spies. So, like in Lviv, which is predominantly Greek Catholic, so it's part of the Roman Catholic Church, but Orthodox in style. There are Russian Orthodox churches going back to Soviet times. No one goes to them because it's not part of the culture there. But they still had monks and priests there that were spying, and they were able to do this for the first full year of the full-scale invasion to get away with it. But there was plenty of evidence that they were helping to direct missile attacks, and it was tricky. Ukraine knew that if they moved against them, there would be a backlash, and this is if you look at I've heard so many stories about places like in southern Ukraine, like the city of Melitopol, where there are a lot of evangelical churches have been destroyed. Their crosses have been taken down and replaced with Russian flags. They've made the evangelical churches into Russian cultural outposts because the Russians only can accept. Russia is a society of one. It's a society. It's a vertical society, and it all radiates from the Kremlin. And so every institution there is a mechanism to control the people. Ukraine is this horizontal society where it's this wild freedom, and it can be chaotic, and it is true freedom. But you have many different institutions, and I think about like when we look at even the structure of Moscow, the Kremlin is the symbol. In Kyiv, you can't even picture the government buildings. You picture the Maidan where the people have their protest, and you picture the church of Saint Sophia, which is older than Moscow itself, the seat of Slavic Christianity, and the Golden Dome Monastery of Saint Michael. And as you go around Kyiv, for example, there are signs everywhere saying, in English, Saint Michael is the patron and the symbol of Kyiv. And there really is this deep devotion to the ancient roots of, and Saint Michael is a Judeo-Christian hero, but the ancient roots of Christianity. It's pervasive here, and let alone throw in the free speech. The fact that, Ukrainians, for example, they're always criticizing the president and everyone else. And so the devotion to freedom here is absolute, and it is shameful how this has been distorted in the U.S. And there was the movie last summer, The Sound of Freedom. And when I first heard they were making that movie, I said, "Oh, maybe Hollywood at last is talking about Ukraine." No, of course not. And Sound of Freedom was number 3 in the box office, right behind Barbie and Oppenheimer. And the guy Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in Passion of the Christ and Count of Monte Cristo, it was a real life story. This guy Tim Ballard, who's portrayed as an American hero in that film, saving kids from sex trafficking. Tim Ballard was in Ukraine for 1 week. He was in Lviv. He never left Lviv. And when he was promoting that film especially to evangelical and Catholic Americans, he went on the most popular podcast on Fox News, and he said about Ukraine absolute lies. He said that children are being kidnapped. He never once mentioned Russia. And then he said this horrible thing. He said, "We found that when I was in Ukraine, we discovered a pedophile political party that they have there." That's exactly how he spoke, because he knew he was lying, so he kind of used a passive voice. And I immediately tweeted, like, "This is absolutely ridiculous." The party he was referring to existed in the Netherlands like 10 years ago. I said, "Show evidence." And friends of mine, some household names even, very popular American conservatives, faith, family, freedom people, attacked me and said, "How dare you attack Tim?" I said, "This is the country where people are actually dying for these values of faith, family, freedom." And it is mystifying, and maybe not so mystifying, but that these popular, comfortable voices in America who make money based on the idea that they actually are defending these values, are doing everything they can to lie about this situation and to attack Ukraine.
What was his motivation in doing that? Is he just a supporter of Russia?
it's hard to know. I think part of it is, and I saw a little bit of this when I worked at News Corporation. You know, you see, well, the way the algorithms are going, and you know that if you, you know, Ukraine was an easy punching bag, and if you attack Ukraine, you know, and maybe it worked because that movie became a blockbuster.
Well,
You know, even
those pedophile claims against Ukraine generated from QAnon and from other extraordinarily radical, perverse sites themselves. I think it's incredibly troubling because that's fiction. That's made up. Here's a fact. There's 100,000 or 20,000 kids that have been kidnapped by Russia, and maybe 100,000. We don't know the scope of who they are. That's a fact.
Yeah,
That's documented.
Interestingly about that, Russia claims the higher number of children they've abducted from Ukraine. They're proud of it, and they boast, which is shocking. As you know, they're putting them through re-education camps, and they're not allowing these Ukrainian kids to speak Ukrainian and all these other different things. The Russians are boasting of this, and yet we have this double narrative of there's like this complete disconnect in America of not understanding at all what's going on.
I feel just
well, and it's, yeah, I'm glad you made that point because even the Russians, they're clear about it, and this is where, you know, a few simple facts should clear this up. Like, all right, for example, even according to Russian government data from before the pandemic, so 2019, you look at the church attendance at Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, which is a nation much bigger than Ukraine. You know, 50 million people. More people were attending Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, smaller Ukraine, than in Russia, and that doesn't even count, you know, the Protestants and the Greek Catholics and the Roman Catholics. And so, even on the numbers, Ukraine is a deeply religious nation. You know, in Moscow, no one celebrates Christmas, just New Year's. Everything was erased by the Soviets. And then look at the language question. You know, one thing that the pro-Russians say is that, you know, they're protecting Russian speakers. It's absolutely absurd. I mean, even you know, in Lviv, in the west of Ukraine, where they preserve their language, so many of the refugees from the east are now in Lviv, and it annoys people in Lviv because they speak Russian, but people just complain under their breath. And here I am in Kharkiv. You know, people, it's a Russian-speaking city, but the more they get attacked, the more they try to speak Ukrainian. You know, it's their own choice because they're so filled with disgust at everything Russian at this point.
I interviewed. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say I have friends from Kharkiv, and they went to school there because it's a big academic city, and they have told me that they grew up, you know, going to school there, trying to speak Russian because that was the popular cool thing, and not wanting to speak Ukrainian because it, you know, it would, because all the Russians who lived in Russia who visited Ukraine, they would tell them, you know, don't speak Ukrainian, stupid, you know, backwards villagers speak that. Well, since the invasion has happened, even though they speak both, there's no way they're going to continue speaking Russian now when they're getting their houses literally bombed every day. But it was this interesting story of on the one hand, growing up speaking Russian and having, even after the independence of Ukraine, there's sort of this cultural suppression in Russia and on the border of, well, you guys are just small Russians anyways. And after the full-scale invasion, this blossoming of identity saying, hey, wait a moment, we can't live like this anymore. We have to embrace who we are, our culture, our language. And it's actually kind of funny because Putin's war of stamping out the Ukrainian identity has backfired, and he's made it there's nothing he can do about it now because it has blossomed in such a way, recovering hundreds of years of history and culture and language. It's very ironic.
This language issue, of course, is one of the principal arguments that Putin has used for what he did 10 years ago by invading Crimea, invading the East. We are there to free Russian-speaking people from oppression. This is essentially the same argument that Hitler made during the pre-World War II time periods, or at the beginning of World War II. We're going to liberate the Germanic people. We're going to protect our borders from the West. We are going to give a space for people that are part of identity. I live in the state of Texas. In my city, the majority of people are Spanish speakers. I can guarantee you, U.S. does not want to give back my town to Mexico. It's true for many other places. If you go to Belgium today, there is no Belgian language. There's Dutch is one official language, French is another official language, and German is the third official language. There's no Belgian language, and yet the people identify as being Belgians. So this issue of if I'm Russian, if we speak Russian, therefore it belongs to us, is something that he's used to confuse a lot of Americans, but on its face, it's really absurd.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and look at Dublin, they speak English because it was colonized, and it's the same in Kharkiv, you know. And if you go to the villages outside of, even in the east, people still always spoke Ukrainian. It was in the cities where, Honor, as you said, it became cool and trendy to speak Russian. I mean, President Zelensky, when he was a comedian, would speak Russian, and he would make fun of Ukrainian speakers. That's why there was a lot of skepticism toward him before the full-scale invasion in the West. He actually made fun of them. That was the culture, was so to mock those Ukrainian peasants, and that's all transformed now. And you know, as you look at, you know, the language also contains so much of the identity. And one aspect, I mean, you see this all the time, but you know, we speak the, you know, about like the way we speak reveals who we are and who we're becoming. And you look at Russian versus Ukrainian language, the word for crime. I don't know if you guys ever looked into. So the word for crime, you know, think of Crime and Punishment. You know, Dostoevsky's great book. The word for crime in Russian is something, I don't speak Russian. It's like pristoplenia, which means stepping over the line. So the crime is the line is whatever the authority decrees, and a crime is to step over that line. For Ukrainians, the word for crime is coincident with the word for evil. It's an evil doing, zloshnist. And so this, it reveals so much, because Ukrainians will certainly break rules, you know, here and there. They have no affection for authority, for political authority. They're like going back to the days of the wild Cossacks. They you know, even there's this tradition of anarchy here, but which is always based on community and church and family ruling themselves, and not some other government. And so for Ukrainian, crime deeply means to do something that we know in our hearts is evil. That's a crime. And for Russians, it's not about good and evil. It's about stay in line and don't break the, and you know, just do whatever you're told. And like this battle, this war is the two polar opposites of how we can live on Earth. And everyone else is in the middle of that spectrum. And there's huge debates, you know, which way do we go? And I know so many Americans are wanting to move toward this real idea of freedom. And so far, so many have been missing this. Again, maybe because it seems too extraordinary, but this is the great fight to determine how we arrange our lives on this earth. The two total opposites right here. And I'm 30 miles. I mean, I'm from the dividing line between that opposite of totalitarianism and that opposite pole of wild freedom.
Joe, redemption is a really important concept in the Christian faith. It's an important concept in culture. The idea that we can overcome problems, that we can be forgiven, that we can move forward. It's really fundamental. It's actually in every movie script. It's in every story that's ever been told. So even though people don't always understand the theological implications or the philosophical implications, and those are real, of redemption, it is a theme. When I look at Ukraine, I see a country that's going through redemption in a real sense. You mentioned Zelensky. Talk about a guy who has been transformed. It's almost as if he was okay, maybe, and then boom, the moment came and he rose to the occasion in a manner no one could have predicted. And it's the very sort of thing that historically we would praise something like that. We would say, wow, this guy rose to the occasion. Do you see that with somebody like Zelensky? Do you see that within the culture? Because it's everywhere I go in Ukraine, part of the hope is we're throwing off the shackles of Russia. We're throwing off the shackles of the Soviet Union. Where did corruption come from? Russia. And we've held on to it. But we want to be done with it. Joe, I talked to one person. I said, what do you think we should do with people that are corrupt? And she said, cut off their hands. And the Ukrainians just don't want to tolerate it. But tell me about whether it's Zelensky or the country. Do you agree that there's this sort of redemption theme we're missing here?
Yeah, I mean, we see that. I see that at every level. And for quick side note on corruption, I mean, we have plenty of corruption in Washington in the West, and because I know that that's one point. That, oh, you're just hating Russia. The corruption is a problem around the world, and we're seeing that. That's part of the reason why we see a lot of dishonesty about Ukraine in Washington and other places. And I think this is where there's a chance even for Americans to find some redemption in our politics, to look to Ukraine as an example. But we forget in World War II, so many leaders in Europe who we consider noble people, kings and queens and prime ministers, went to rule in exile. They went to Canada or the UK, and we still think of them as noble heroes of their country. So what Zelensky did was extraordinary. It was. I mean, everyone thought that outside of Ukraine, that Kyiv was going to fall in a matter of days, and that personal decision to choose to be courageous, not to run away, when he could have had still all these great accolades and gone to exile, and that was transformative. I mean, you can look back into the lead up to the full scale invasion. It could be a fair argument to call Zelensky an appeaser. That perhaps he was, the candidate. The Kremlin waited perhaps till he was president, until other factors around the world as well. But that personal courageous act, you can even see it in his appearance, has to be necessarily transformative. And I've seen this with so many. I see this with Ukrainians, but especially I'd say with Americans who come here. There was an American veteran friend of mine from Afghanistan, and he said after Afghanistan, he went right back to the U.S. and he couldn't sleep at night. He was thinking, what have I given my skills and my life, and I was willing to risk my life for what? And he had horrible PTSD. And then he came here and he said he could sleep at night, even though the battles were scarier here than what he saw in Afghanistan, because it was a redemption for him and there was purpose here. I see that with so many people. I've seen it myself. I mean, I feel like when I was in News Corp and Fox News on the Avenue of the Americas in New York, we didn't know anything about the world, and yet we purported to tell the stories and thereby sort of control the narratives. And that's why here I see, it's redemptive to be here every day, intensely sharing the realities of people, without the filter of the elites. And so, yeah, it's a redemption quest for so many people. And I say even like, this might sound preposterous, but, like coming here to Kharkiv, I tell people, if you're depressed or feeling a little bit, lacking purpose in life, you're welcome. We'll do our best to keep you as safe as possible. But there's something here that I've seen it with so many people, whether it's elite reporters or just retirees or whatever coming here. This place will transform you in this time.
Joe, it's been 2 years. This is the 2-year anniversary. And I think it would be a good thing for us just to take inventory of what we've learned in 2 years. So here's what I'm going to ask. I'm curious, what have we learned about Ukraine? What have we learned about Russia? What have we learned about Europe? What have we learned about America? And I really think these are an important consideration. Let's start with Ukraine. And we've covered some of it, but let's just summarize. The world's learned a lot about Ukraine, but what are the big takeaways of what Ukraine has given the world in 2 years? I mean, certainly one seems to me that in this David and Goliath story, people that were condemned to absolute failure within 3 days to a week have defied the odds. And I can't tell you how many times my heart has been broken to hear Tucker or other people say Ukraine is losing, they have failed, they have lost. And I think, doesn't the mere fact that they're here in 2 years mean that a miracle has taken place? What have we learned about Ukraine in 2 years?
Well, I think Ukraine is, Americans, we love superhero stories. We love the Marvel movies. And this is the real life superhero story. I mean, there's a reason why Ukrainians call the invading Russians orcs. I mean, this is a battle of good versus evil, and Ukrainians have showed us, and it's not easy. I mean, look, there's plenty of tensions here, and people have their dark moments, especially as this goes on. But that there are things worth believing in and fighting for. That this is a values-based resistance against nihilism, ultimately. And nihilism comes in many forms, and most of us are kind of in this in-between nihilism, just tolerating things, even if we're not happy about it, and feel that we're missing out on something. And we only have one life on this planet, and if we're, I think we see so much of this heaviness in America, and maybe this is what we learn about America, but this is why when so many Americans come here, when they go back to the U.S., they want to get back to Ukraine, even under the missiles, because here, I think they learn how to live, and maybe the heart of it, as I've tried to wrestle with, what is the secret of this? People, over the centuries settled America in many ways to get away from strife in Europe. We don't have Mexico and Canada invading. And so, by that sense, the American experiment has worked. But what I've seen here is that, when you cut off your roots, the Ukrainians are, the roots going back for, thousands of years, even when it comes to recipes and religious rituals. When you cut off those roots, we're just blowing in the wind in eternity, in the universe. And we don't know how to make sense of things. We lose our ability to interact with our neighbors and our society. And that makes us isolated and lost. And this is, I think, explains, we don't have war in America, but we have internal war. We have violence, all the school shootings. We have violence in our cities. You don't see that here. And so I think Ukrainians, this is part of the story that maybe the world hasn't seen yet, but it is the connection to these ancient roots, which also includes this deep tradition of freedom that has enabled Ukrainians to survive as they have against this, evil empire that sends. I mean, freedom, true freedom, grounded in tradition and faith, like faith, family freedom, is such a threat to the nihilist in power that they will send billions of dollars worth of missiles every week for 2 years to destroy it, and still they can't destroy it.
What have we learned about Russia?
Well, it's a nation of nihilists. It's a nation of people, and this, I think, should be a warning for us in America, we in America, because, and one of my favorite writers has always been Dostoevsky. I think he's so well diagnosed Russia's soul sickness in the 19th century, especially with his book Demons, which talks about how people became caught up in radical political movements in Russia, and sort of overcome by nihilism. And we see, lately I've been calling Russia the school shooter of nations. It's a nation that is totally immersed in the idea of victimhood, and they're, everything's bad, everyone's mean to me, and so I'm just going to burn everything down. And what worries me, and I hope Americans can start to see this, because I see that idea taking hold in America on the left and the right. Everyone's a victim of everything. And when you start to let it take hold, you tear apart the fabric of society, and you start harming others. And so I hope that if we can learn this about Russia, we can avoid becoming like that in our own countries.
There's a film that is being released, and the film is all about captured communications of Russian soldiers to their mothers. Now, yesterday I reviewed part of it. It was completely chilling. I had seen some of these things before, but it was really hard to read and listen to them. You know, Russian soldiers saying, "Hey, today I tortured and I shot children," and the mothers back in Russia saying, "They're our enemy. You should feel no, that's good. Keep shooting the mothers and the children. We hate them. We want them dead." It was grotesque. And I think as somebody who has been friends with, I've grown up or I've lived in a community made up of Russians and Ukrainians. I used to fence at a Russian gym. I have Russian in my background as well as Ukrainian in my background. I've always enjoyed so many things about Russian people and Russian culture, but there is a utter bloodthirsty cruelty which is institutionalized in the military, which is Waffen SS level. A complete lack, 100% lack of conscience when it comes to the mutilation and destruction of people. And I don't think the West is prepared to realize how diabolically evil it is. They think when we say these things, this is a fantasy we're speaking of. And they haven't been to Bucha or Mariupol, where there are 100,000 people probably in graves. What am I close? Do you have a different perspective?
I think the world has been the past week focused on the death of one Russian, right, of Navalny. At a U2 concert in Las Vegas a few days ago, the crowd was chanting Navalny's name. I'm sure this made Putin smile, because and then we have Biden and President Biden and everyone else. Oh, we need sanctions because of the death of Navalny. So why no? We should have had maximum sanctions after the wiping out of entire cities like Mariupol, the horrible tragedies in Bucha, most recently in Avdiivka. But no, the world focused on one Russian victim, and this is what the Russians are very good at, making the world sort of pulling the world into their story of victimhood. And this is, which is amazing, because so many of the American right, they oppose the idea of being a victim, but they're actually embracing the victims in chief, and even to the point of people chanting Navalny's name, who was okay with Russia taking Crimea, who was a Russian imperialist and didn't think Ukrainians were really an identity, and so yeah, this is I mean, as I look at, for example, when Hamas attacked Israel, Hamas and Moscow and Tehran are allied, and both Hamas and Russia, two very different, because one's very small, one's large, but they're the same type of ideology, and they both cloak their ideology of nihilistic hate in religion. So the Russians drape it with Russian Orthodoxy, a fake version of Christianity, and Hamas drapes it in Islam. And there's so many stark similarities between those two ideologies, both in the way they acted on October 7th, and then especially what the Russians did when they thought they could get away with it the first months of the full-scale invasion, when it was especially brutal, before they realized that the backlash wasn't going to help them. But the way they attacked, I mean, I know people from Mariupol. It's just, and there was the film that was just honored at the BAFTAs in London, which people should watch. But it's this is what we're facing, and if Ukrainians, it's hard to imagine, because Ukrainians have done an extraordinary thing by holding on. If Ukraine had fallen, or Ukraine had not had their protests in 2014, and they had chosen to be nihilists and said, this is too much, it's too difficult, we can't resist the regime. If they had done that in 2014, then today Ukraine would be like Belarus, but even more so. The Ukrainians would be part of the Russian army, and it would be this massive nihilistic threat to the whole world. And so people thank God for the Ukrainians for resisting that, and 2014 saying, we're not going to be part of this, and we'll take bullets to prove it and to resist it. And I hope that somehow we can break through, that Americans can see this, that this is values-based resistance versus hate-filled, destructive nihilism.
Have we learned anything about Europe? I have to say that personally, I've been a little bit surprised in the best ways. It seems like, to me, the nations that remember World War II and that are facing potentially existential threats themselves to their borders are acting like grown-ups, not perfectly. I don't agree with everything. I'm not sure the commitment is always where it should be or all the choices are right. I don't necessarily like all the leaders personally, but that doesn't matter. They have demonstrated a collective resolve, it seems. What's going on in Europe? What are the big takeaways from what's happened with their response to Putin?
Well, especially the Baltic nations, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and then also Poland, who are close to Russia. Russia has, they were controlled by, behind the Iron Curtain. They have strong memories of that hell, and they know that Russians also want to destroy them. And so, like those little Baltic countries, I think all of them have given about half of their defense budgets to Ukraine, because Ukraine's protecting them, which gets missed. Everyone's thinking, oh, Ukraine has to say thank you to the world. Those countries realize, in fact, Prime Minister Kallas of Estonia said, we thank you, Ukraine. And this is an important reality to get out there, that maybe we should be thanking Ukraine. They understand this. Finland, which has, is now they ran to NATO because they were so scared of the Russian threat. Sweden, they understand the threat that Russia poses, and the United Kingdom. And I think, this is unpopular opinion, but I think if Brexit, it's because of Brexit that the UK has been such a strong independent voice, not pulled down by France and by Berlin and by Paris and Berlin. And the UK cross-party has been incredibly strong. They're the only major nation that has given Ukraine long-range weapons and permission. They should do whatever you need to do. You can hit Russian military bases deep into Russia. Ukrainians have used the Storm Shadow missiles from the UK to hit the naval headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, and they've done so. The UK has led in a way that Washington hasn't, but we still have, in Berlin, where there's a long history of Russian oil money, and sometimes in France. I think we still see a lot of Europeans that will talk a good game, but that, and this is the point that President Trump made, not perhaps very directly, I'll say, in an inflammatory way, but there's still many NATO countries that, even after 2 years of full-scale war in Europe, are not paying the 2%. That seems pretty astounding. So you have a mix in Europe. You have those who see things clearly, and I think who certainly have courage, like the Baltic nations, like Poland, and the UK.
Putin said the other day that he preferred Biden over Trump because Biden was predictable and Trump was not. I've been critical of President Biden on myriad things. I just have a very different worldview than he has. I'm grateful that he stood with Ukraine, but I've also had concerns about the moral problem of giving Ukraine just enough of the wrong things to stay alive, prolonging the war without winning, which is not a Republican problem. It's a Biden problem. It could also be a Republican problem. So I believe whether we're talking Trump or Biden, I think we have to be able to say, here's where they do well, here's where they do poorly. We need to rise above partisanship and just have an objective standard to evaluate that isn't born out of hatred and anger, but it's just objective. Okay, this is good, that's bad. And we can look at the Trump administration, for example, and say they're the ones that broke the Biden shutdown, the Obama shutdown of sending certain arms over to Ukraine. I'm grateful for Trump for doing that. That was a positive thing. Trump has been all over the map on Ukraine. In recent days, he's been terrible. but he might switch back. I have no idea. Do you have an opinion? Is it the end of the world if Donald Trump is president? Because under any circumstance, we have to realize that could happen. Is it the end of the world for Ukraine?
Well, I think you phrased all this well, DW. As I say to everyone who's, especially here, worried about the election, as things currently stand, whether it's Trump or Biden, it's equally bad. I mean, Ukraine is realizing they have to be self-reliant because while it's hard to know, and I think we should have a whole other podcast conversation about the intricacies of sort of American conservative organizations and how they've been absent on this. But there's Trump and everything he said, so it makes we don't know. In some ways, maybe that's good. You want to keep Putin guessing, but the whole world is guessing, including Americans. That's a problem. Whereas like someone like Nikki Haley has been very clear. But then the danger. So President Biden has spoken a great game. I think lately President Biden has been like the Queen or the King of England, like good figurehead. When he came to Kyiv with the aviators, he gave an amazing speech. I mean, that was one of the most powerful. That was the most powerful speech of his presidency. He had incredible energy, and it was defiant. And here in Kyiv in the wartime, but the actions have not been such. I mean, the White House refuses to send long-range weapons. They refuse to give Ukraine permission to attack, to go on offense, but they convey the perception that they're doing everything. And so this actually hurts Ukraine very much because the White House knows the political climate in the U.S. And so they know that there's going to be a backlash. So people think that Biden is here, making money from the defense industry and all that, when actually the White House is doing the maximum of the minimum. Compare it to the UK again. The UK will send long-range weapons. The White House won't. They sent 17 ATACMS in October, those long-range missiles. Ukrainians use them immediately within a week to great effect. Ukrainians hit 2 Russian air bases on occupied Ukrainian soil, and it worked. But then the media doesn't help here. Okay, everyone should have said, okay, the White House sent 17 of these long-range weapons. They worked. Why not send more? And there was just total silence on that because I think that there is, and this is what's happening now. It's, they want to, the diehard proponents of the president want everyone just to focus on Trump, which we should do. But if you do that at the expense, there's a lot that's going to happen between now and the election. You can't do that while giving the White House a free pass. And so and there's no. So we are. If you're in the Kremlin, are you scared of any actions that the White House is taking right now? I don't think so. They're leading by timidity. So
here's a thought as well. We've been talking about Biden. There's been lots of great talk and words from the Biden administration, but compared to what we should be doing and what we could be doing, it is vastly and shockingly lacking. And we're kind of at a crossroads right now because even as it's true that Ukraine has held on and they're continuing to fight and they're holding the Russian bear at bay, but even as that is true on the one hand, we're in a very difficult moment. Ammunition shortages and equipment shortages are frighteningly low. There was just the reshuffles with the generals. That's not inherently an issue. It just causes more chaos. And then now we have the withdrawal and the loss of Avdiivka, partly because of that lack of proper funding and support by the Biden administration. As we go forward into 2024, and we have sort of a compounding of Western allied failures and shortcomings from what they should be doing, as we go forward into 2024, what needs to be done for Ukraine to have a successful and victorious 2025? Because it's likely not going to happen this year. But what does America and what do the allies need to do to get Ukraine on a winning track instead of just as long as it takes track, like Biden likes to say?
Yeah, that's what they always say, Otter. They say as long as it takes, without saying, and this is why I understand a lot of the Republican opposition, because if you know very little about Ukraine and all you hear, as long as it takes, and you're already sick of the war machine, and then not just Republican opposition, but the fans of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And like, this sounds like the war machine. And then, you know what? It actually is. And I know people from the Pentagon or formerly of the Pentagon who, they profit from this going on for a long time. And so they do not want quick victory. I met some of these defense contractors. They came here, they were like ants. They were all over here at the beginning. They would get mad at me for talking about the Maidan Revolution. They didn't want to be inspired because then they'd have to convert and say, wait, I believe in this and I want real victory. And so I think conversion is the key. I think, what this is going to first take is popular American voices on the right, especially, like Joe Rogan and all those popular podcasts, for a few of them to have this. And there's hope for this because Americans like these come to Jesus transformation moments. Like, I was blind and now I see. We need something like this to happen in our popular media. And then there's a hope that can sort of, awaken Americans to the reality, because, 2023 was a record year for the American defense industry. We sold the most, we made the most money ever selling American defense products in our history. So
I didn't know that.
That's because, yeah, it's extraordinary. And so this is used by a talking point of the anti-Ukraine crowd, like, this war is, Ukrainians are dying at the expense of the defense industry, but they're missing the nuance. And both the political operatives in America and especially the Russians, they love nuance because you can smudge it all over. And the reality is Ukrainians are not going to give up fighting, but it's a slow trickle of weapons that keeps Ukraine on some kind of life support that benefits the defense industry. Ukrainians are testing and MacGyvering stuff here, and so it's actually benefiting America in so many ways. But then the more Europe especially gets afraid, the more countries are going to buy weapons from the U.S. And we see, like Poland buying 486 HIMARS after the free sample of 39 given to Ukraine. So this slow trickle of weapons benefits the defense industry and the elites. And this is the questions that need to be put to the White House. But I think deepest down, probably, a lot of the policy I think is, is driven by Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and whoever influences him. A lot of these people in Washington come from the school of Henry Kissinger, who I used to go to, as I've talked about, I used to go to baseball games with him. And it's a school of, they don't, you can have freedom, but it's like you can have your bread and circus freedom, but don't be too radical. We're going to keep the peace. We're going to manage the chess pieces of the world. As Kissinger said, Russia is necessary in the global equilibrium. I think a lot of people are afraid. It's the same with any people in leadership position who aren't really leaders. They're like, well, I'm just going to do half measures because if I do a full measure and it turns out bad, then I'm at fault. Maybe I can kind of hide in the crevices. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing in Washington.
As a follow-up to that, there's also in this sort of managing the issue crowd who are generally supportive of Ukraine, but if we're talking about being serious, they're not serious about it. There's sort of this the idea coming up again and again of how do we manage this and just get it to go away? Well, negotiate, give away territory, just make it stop. That sounds sort of reasonable when you're in America, but then when you're in Ukraine, that's not even an option. Nobody is seriously talking about that. And even as the war is getting difficult and they're having questions which they're needing to ask now as they're getting, deeper and deeper into this, how do we keep Americans aligned with actually what is happening with Ukrainians and what Ukrainians are fighting for? Because Ukrainians are very clear-eyed. We need our country and we need total victory. How do we keep Americans aware of the fact that this can't become sort of a gray, win-lose 50-50 for Russia? This needs to be a clear victory for Ukraine so that this does not keep happening.
Well, you see how Americans, they want to stand with protest movements around the world, be it in Ireland or Canada. It's simply a matter of them understanding what Ukrainians are standing for and how they live every day. That's a matter of sharing that story as much as possible. But then we can look at very practical things that show what Ukrainians can do. Like, I think maybe the single most powerful example, the Black Sea. And, when there was the deal with Russia, brokered by United Nations and Turkey, the grain export deal, then that deal, the Russians broke it, and it stopped in July of 2023. Since then, so now it's February 2024. Since July of 2023, less than a year, Ukrainians. So the first month there was no grain was exported through the Black Sea.
Mm-hmm.
Ukrainians began to use missiles from the UK and drones to attack the Russian Navy and fight their way to create a grain corridor, and they have. And they've exported more grain in a smaller space of time than they did during the entire time with the treaty with Russia. So this should show us that the only way, because Russia's motives, or you should, that they want to destroy Ukraine and many other countries. The only way to do it is to fight, and actually it can work. And every time that, Russia's always scaring people with the red lines. I mean, Ukrainians destroyed the headquarters of the Russian the Black Sea Fleet.
Yeah.
The Russian Navy had to move away out of Crimea. This is extraordinary, and it often gets missed. So these points should show, and President Zelensky said this in his Fox News interview that's airing today, that he emphasized what's happening in the Black Sea. These should show that with tools, Ukrainians can get it done, and the Russians have no response. And I think it's a matter of sharing that. And I think we keep hearing about F-16s, and I'm pretty convinced. I mean, it keeps getting kicked down. They're like, oh, it'll be there by the end of 2023. It'll be there by March. It'll be there by September. I think the U.S. does not want to give F-16s until there's some kind of partition, and some kind of deal, because they have this block in their mind, and they keep thinking Ukraine is somehow going to give up, and they keep having to push back the date, because Ukraine, so this should show us that Ukrainians are not going to give up. And here in Kharkiv, like at any moment, a missile could hit here, and as this happened, quite close to me fairly often, almost always before the air raid alarm, because we're so close to Russia. And after 2 years, Washington still refuses to give permission for Ukraine to hit 30 miles across this, from here, across the border. Mm-hmm. Ukrainians are able to use drones and their own tools to now and then hit. The one time when they recently hit a Russian city that has been based for bombing Ukraine, the United Nations was having a hearing the next day, decrying Ukraine. So it is organizations like the White House and the UN that are constraining Ukraine. And we have to be very clear about this.
Joe, we are looking at the end of this. Well, we've had 2 years now, and I think it would be helpful for us to paint a picture for our audience. Here's what it looks like if Ukraine were to lose. Here's what it looks like if Ukraine were to win. Let's start off with what it looks like if it were to lose. And by lose, I mean, not only does Russia hold on to the seized territory that belonged to Ukraine, that's a loss, period. But also, they ultimately move forward and they denazify the rest of Ukraine itself. What does that look like for a world refugee crisis?
Well, for one, this is a question I discuss with Ukrainians frequently, because you can have honest conversations in the wartime. Ukrainians won't surrender. So you'll see, as we saw, in Kyiv, they were prepared to fight to the death. Same here in Kharkiv. They won't surrender. And so it's not even about a refugee crisis. By the way, when Ukrainians as refugees, they tend to go and they get jobs so they can buy drones to send home. They've improved the economy of Poland. The Ukrainian refugees, have actually helped many countries. And
they don't like to be called They don't like to be called refugees. They like to be thought of as temporarily displaced.
Yeah, and so many of them have come back. They got tired of living a nice. The women who could live on a beach in Spain and instead come back here. But Ukrainians have shown already that they won't quit in the most difficult of circumstances. I mean, last winter was so much more difficult than now. No heat, no power, no electricity, more frequent attacks, and they survived it. So the evidence is there that Ukrainians will hold on. But as we've seen with any city that falls into Russian occupation, it is like it's like 1984, World War II, sort of nightmare, Gestapo controlled society, based on, your religion, your language, all of that. You have to get in line with what the state says. So all of that would come back, this new Iron Curtain. And it's, something that you can't even imagine, but we can see evidence of it. We see how Russians destroy cities. And when it comes to victory, I was just talking with friends here about that last night. They sort of get tears in their eyes because it's heavy. It seems so far away, but there is daily victory happening, like the constant rebuilding. My coffee shop was bombed a few weeks ago, and 5 hours later I went there, and in the ruins they were serving coffee. So this is already victory, and victories, I think, holding on is part of this. But in the long run, it's gonna, we can build up some kind of real defense, which would be ideal if it was all of Ukraine, so like weapons here in Kharkiv that would push the Russians back in their own country. At least that's a first step. Continuing to make Crimea untenable, which they've done amazing work at, but they need more tools to do so. They've already hit some of the most key Russian targets in Crimea. Russians have no response. So if we could actually just pour the heat on there in Crimea and make it untenable and cut it off, things like that, then all of a sudden you're going to start to see more and more, with every day of some small victory, you can see the real possibility. But ultimately, it's going to mean, it's going to have to be a transformation in Russia, maybe the breakup of the Russian Federation. I know people steadily working on this, with people in different republics of Russia. That has to be part of it. But that could get overwhelming. But the first, just look at what has been achieved so far, compared this winter to last winter, and you start to see these are things that get missed in the headlines because journalists forget about this stuff and they're not here every day. This is a victory. This is a 2-year anniversary of victorious resistance against a machine of hellfire. It's extraordinary. And so based on that, let's just keep adding tools to this with cheerful defiance, and we can get there.
Joe Lindsley, aka Winston Churchill in Kyiv. Wow, that was a great wrap up. Never, never, never surrender. Fight them on the beaches. The Ukrainian spirit. It's why England understands they have the same history. To all of our friends that are listening in Ukraine, we want to say happy anniversary. Your hell, your survival has been instructive for the next 100 years about how a nation stands defiant in faith and in unity against an absolute evil committing atrocities, in many cases are simply unspeakable, that are happening there. We thank God for you. We pray that people around the world will lift up their hearts in prayer for Ukraine on this anniversary day. Make sure you listen to Joe. Tune into Joe. His broadcasts are great. I always smile afterwards. They're humorous. They're intelligent. They're on point. They're great. They're as good as anything that's out there. So make sure to listen to that. And we thank you. Joe, thank you for giving us all this time. I think you've got a concert you need to go to, so we want to let you go. But this has been great. And once again, thank you for joining us on Ukraine Story Podcast. Slava Ukraini.
William Slava, honor, TW. Thank you, guys.